Hello, this is David Bernstein. I'm the founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and this is the Jewish Contrarians podcast and live stream event. I'm not with my usual partner in crime, Brandy Shafutinsky. Brandy's on the road, but I do have a new thought crime partner, Marcy Braverman Goldstein. Marcy is JILV's brand new Director of Academic Affairs. Great to have you on, Marcy.
Thank you so much.
So, Marcy, I'll let you sort of talk about your background. You know, you got a doctor in front of your name, even though you're not putting that. Dan doesn't have that up right now, but you're an academic yourself, but you've sort of gone in other directions as well. You're an expert on religion and particularly Hinduism. Tell us a little bit more about that, your academic background and why you're here.
Sure. So I earned my PhD in religious studies from UC Santa Barbara a little over 20 years ago. I love teaching people about religions other than their own. I've taught world religions at a range of universities across country, both public and private universities. And I'm an expert in Indian traditions, yoga traditions, Hinduism, and Buddhism. And I have also taught in the yoga world, where I take a lot of my academic classes and I boil them down to sort of user-friendly amounts of time for curious adults who are seeking knowledge and yet don't really want to pay for a university level class. So at heart, I'm a teacher and I'm really happy to be here.
That's great. So, Marcy, we have been working together on an open letter from Jewish scholars. It's not officially our letter. It's a letter that we've worked with Jewish academics behind the scenes. Dan, I don't know if you can post a link to it. I'm sure you can. Might take you a second. But the letter is from Jewish scholars. There's a few non-Jews in there. And they've signed a letter that calls upon academia to reflect on itself, that increasingly it's in a intellectually stifling environment that doesn't allow critical thinking very often, that doesn't allow good ideas to come to the surface. It warns about the dangers of that, and the dangers not just to academia but to the larger society. And it also warns the American Jewish community that this ideology, this what we call like a neo-Manichaean ideology, it's sort of this stark division between the oppressed and the oppressors, gives rise to a variant of anti-Semitism, and that we have to be aware of that and be able to counter and recognize it as a problem. And so for us, this letter, this scholar's letter, has two goals. One, it's to warn the Jewish community that there's an ideology that from many of the top thinkers within the Jewish community, there are about 350 signatories at this point, many of the top thinkers of the Jewish community, people that they know, that they've heard from, scholars that they've always prized, that they bring to their meetings sometimes to talk about issues that are on their minds, that many of those people are deeply, deeply concerned about the discourse in the academy today and what it might do to the larger society and how it might in particular affect Jews. That's number one. The second, of course, is for us to be a voice within the heterodox academic world and to make sure that we're weighing in on the state of the academy and the nature of scholarship and the rest. So that's why we're so happy to have you, Marcy, because I think you're the perfect person to help us with both. Talk a little bit about what you've been in the academic world, scholarship world. What do you think is the problem? How would you describe it?
Well, I've seen a lot of illiberalism creeping in for a long time. At first, I was really surprised, and I actually felt kind of betrayed because I always thought that the university was like a universe of opinions. But what I've seen from just reading the news and lots of examples of things happening to professors where they're shunned, sometimes forced into resigning, and then also conversations that I have or try to have sometimes with colleagues where I'm just kind of attacked and my viewpoint isn't necessarily welcome. And I see other people's viewpoints not necessarily welcome. So I just see it as like a creeping illiberalism. And it got, to such a point that I realized I just have to do something about it. And so I'm just really happy to, have this platform and this opportunity to, create positive change so that it's not just sort of more visible identities that are welcome on campus with safe spaces and all that, but also actually, viewpoint diversity, which a lot of different statistics are showing is absolutely lacking. And so I think that's inclusion and representation is a value of mine, and I think everybody's, but the academic world is really falling short of that in so many ways.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the letter has already 350 signatories. There are a lot more Jewish academics and scholars than 350, but it's got 350. I've heard from people who have said, I would sign it, but it would put me at risk, especially younger academics that are not well established might feel that this would hurt their career. And I've heard that explicitly from a few. Mm-hmm. We've heard some others that that they agree with the letter, but they're also concerned about the threat toward academic freedom on the right. And they don't want to sign anything that would pay that short shrift. The letter does mention that at the very beginning, but it moves on into the threat coming from the left. And then, of course, there are people who just don't sign letters, right? There are, I've gotten that. I agree with every word in this, but I'm just not a letter signer, and I like to express myself in my own terms. So that's another theme you hear. But having said that, I think we've barely scratched the surface. I mean, we're going to keep on working it, and we think that there's going to be more signatories to come. It is, though, hardening, I would say. Do you agree that 350 Jewish academics, are willing to put their name on there? And it might argue that there is a bit of a thaw in the academic community that's emboldening more and more people to speak up about it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I feel like I'm in really good company. I either know or know of a lot of these scholars. They're senior scholars across the generations, across all different fields in the humanities, social sciences, math, engineering. And they're people who, have been like-minded with me in a broad sort of way, for so long. And so it feels really good to be in that good company. And I do fully understand why some people might not want to sign it, because of the threat of job security is very real. And if I was on the tenure track but not yet tenured, I probably wouldn't be signing it. But instead, I've decided to invest my experience and care for academia in this other way, which is why I'm sitting here with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've done some research on sort of the state of academic viewpoint diversity. Talk a little bit about that. What have you seen? What is the current state of the discourse?
Well, there's a pie chart that Harvard just put out recently that shows, there it is.
You're going to have to describe it also for the listeners. Not everybody is going to see it.
Okay, so the Harvard Crimson, I think a couple months ago, put out this statistic. How would you categorize your political leanings? 2.5% of faculty at Harvard are conservative, 31.8% are very liberal, 45% are liberal, and then there's a few moderates, and 0.4% are very conservative. So I think that viewpoints among the teachers seep out into their lectures either purposely or inadvertently. And so there's really not a wide range of perspectives that students are able to hear as they're wrestling with information and, presumably learning how to think, not what to think. And there are just so many examples, in all the different publications that I'm signed up for, daily, there's information about, such and such a professor was ousted or shunned or, suspended for a certain period of time, when their research reveals information that does not line up with the mainstream narrative. And it doesn't seem like people are curious to explore. It's like just certain viewpoints are shut out. Because the information might be very difficult to deal with, but people are like risk averse or, just really don't want to believe information that's going to upset their worldview is really, I think, what it comes down to, because it's not comfortable to be sort of booted from your echo chamber. And, I do, obviously there is some diversity of opinion, in the scholarly world, but I think there's a silent majority that thinks otherwise, but for various very real and significant reasons, people don't necessarily speak up. And, I have so many examples that I've actually written about. I've written a couple articles about lack of viewpoint diversity in academia. One has been published, another one's about to be published. And I presented a paper about this at an academic conference last November and just sort of went through the litany of examples. And the first comment from somebody in the room said, wow, I didn't realize it was this bad. So it's like it's an open secret. And, a lot of people know, a lot of people, participate in the issue, but they're kind of stuck in, this kind of like systemic viewpoint conformity, I guess, either because that's the way they feel or they're not really able to move around because it's not going to lead to
afraid.
A great result. Yeah.
Yeah. There was a recent case, you were talking about the consequences that someone might face. There was this recent case at UCLA of Yoel Imbar. He was supposed to join the University of California at Los Angeles as a tenured professor of psychology, but the offer didn't materialize because 66 students signed a petition urging the administration not to hire him. And that's only because he expressed some mild criticism of diversity, equity, and inclusion statements. Now, DEI statements. Now, what is a DEI statement? It's a statement that the university or a specific department of the university may require faculty to put forward before they're hired as either or given tenure. By the way, sometimes it's used to establish tenure, and sometimes it's used just to get in the door, and sometimes both. Not all universities have utilized DEI statements, but a lot have. It's increasingly common. So you're supposed to say what your view is on diversity, equity, inclusion. Now, you can see how this could easily be used as a political litmus test. It's a way to ferret out people who don't go along with the current orthodoxies. So those people are either forced to lie about their views on these issues, or they're going to make stuff up. They're going to make stuff up, or they're going to say something that they don't believe, as I said before, or and if they say something, if they challenge the current orthodoxy, they could easily lose a job, not get a job. No one will know. A lot of times there's multiple candidates, so it's very easy to pretend like you're using a different criteria. So I think it's very, very concerning, and it's just another way to that pie chart that you showed. That just another way to edge out all the conservatives there, because they're just not gonna they're not able to be honest about their authentic points of view, and that has to reflect itself in the teaching.
Yeah, but I would also just add, if I could, that it's not just conservatives, it's tons of liberals. I mean, obviously all these terms I think are changing meaning. I think most people that we're referring to, probably everybody, cares deeply about inclusion. It's just that there's certain methods to use to achieve that goal, and not everybody agrees with this particular method that sort of relies on this division between people, usually, the oppressor-oppressed categorization. That's a binary that lacks nuance and is usually not, very complexifying. And so while I think we all maybe, are seeking the same goal of caring for all the young people who show up to discover information in universities, that they, we should all, have a shot at that and be part of the conversation. But there's certain, roots to that are going to maybe self-sabotage and not help us achieve that goal. And so somebody who doesn't want to sign the DEI statement, is classically liberal, wants this goal of inclusion, but not through this particular top-down, forced approach.
Yeah. So I'm going to read something. A philosophy professor, a very prominent public intellectual, actually wrote me, and I had a back and forth with her on it. I'm not going to say who it is because she didn't give me permission to say it publicly. Mm-hmm. Hi, I won't sign for two reasons. First, I don't see Jewish scholars as a group having a particular expertise in addressing these questions, or as any sort of natural group, okay? Second, in my experience of 30 years of teaching, what this letter addresses is a phobic stereotype of the academy, not the daily reality I experience as a teacher and colleague. No doubt the University of blank defends the values you care about, but it is not alone. And I bet if you polled philosophy professors all over the country, you would find that our discipline, at least, they're very healthy and strong. I think that it's interesting. First of all, I was a philosophy major undergrad, and I've always very curious about the state of the discipline. I've asked philosophy professors. Some will say, yes, philosophy is actually held up better than others, and others start to roll their eyes and say, absolutely not. sort of these postmodern trends that started to overtake it. That may depend or vary on philosophy department to philosophy department. I suspect she's right, but I don't think that that's representative of what we're seeing elsewhere in the humanities. I mean, philosophy, if anything, is a discipline that's devoted to critical thinking. I don't know how it could be philosophy if it tries to squelch critical thinking. But that's not the case with a lot of others, like sociology and political science, psychology. Even the study of history. I think they're all very vulnerable to academic capture and takeover. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think a lot of these different departments have been captured and taken over. And I don't think it's really actually what did she say, a phobic stereotype. I think that a lot of professors are self-reporting that this is the way it is. And I have a quote here from a professor at University of Hawaii who is as liberally minded as it gets. And he said, we have to overturn the academic tables that support the ideological insanity currently masquerading as liberal education.
Yeah.
So I think there's plenty of voices who say this about the institution in which they are situated, but it's going to take some new angles into the problem to shift the tides, and that is, I think, one reason why I'm here and we are gathering an academic advisory committee so that we can collectively figure out how to shift things, kind of back to the way they were, but maybe even make things better. And I also, better than they maybe ever have been. And I gained some inspiration also from the founder of UATX, a new university that's sort of similarly committed to viewpoint diversity. And he kind of looked around at the legacy institutions and realized that, maybe they're so broken they can't be fixed. So we're just starting this new thing. And he said, we can't wait for the cavalry. We have to be the cavalry.
Right. Yes. And I want to talk about that, whether these institutions can be reformed. Before we do that, though, I was thinking, I had lunch not too long ago with a sociology professor who was telling me about his trials and tribulations teaching sociology, and he's a heterodox thinker. And he was saying that he cannot teach multiple viewpoints or perspectives about the sources of social disparities, even present multiple theories. And if he does that, he has been accused by students of centering white narratives rather than of just engaging in critical inquiry. And when that's happened, the students have complained to his dean, and he's been put in a really bad place because of that. The dean says, I'm sorry, maybe you are centering white voices. So instead of supporting them in this level of inquiry that you would expect at a university where you can argue about these very important, complex topics about why do some people have more than others, we're given a one-size-fits-all explanation, prepackaged, that it's only systemic factors, only systemic racism, only structural racism or disparity. For all the disparity, disparity in and of itself is proof positive of discrimination and racism. And I think that that's really disheartening. Does that exist everywhere? I think it exists a lot. I think a lot of professors don't even bother trying to delve into these hot topics because they don't want some small group of students. And I do agree with that philosophy professor who said it's not everywhere. Among students, I think there's probably a lot of students who are very open-minded, but even if it's 2 or 3 students, those students can raise a ruckus, and the university becomes so wimpy. And many of the administrators, especially, I think, are so accustomed to squelching diverse points of view, they don't even know that they're doing it. They're just upholding diversity as a value in their view. So yeah, what do you make of all that? I know that was a mouthful.
Yeah, well, they're all really sensitive topics, and racism exists for sure. But I think when people are looking through this lens, these racial categories, people might find racism where it doesn't exist because that's the lens through which they're looking. And again, these are really sensitive topics, and I'm hesitant to talk about it too. But I've decided that the end justifies the means. It's worth it because we have to try to sort of navigate through these narratives, because I'm committed. I'm a truth seeker. I want to find what the truth is. And if it's really uncomfortable and upsetting, so be it. I tell students, a lot of the time, just because it's popular doesn't mean it's true. Everybody around us might be saying the same thing because we surround ourselves with like-minded people because it feels good psychologically. But sometimes our social milieu is sort of, reinforces what we think, just like a social media algorithm. And so we have to have the courage to peek out, but that doesn't go well for a lot of professors. An example that I'm thinking of is Roland Fryer at Harvard, this
yes, we know him well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he was the youngest African-American to be awarded tenure at Harvard, and he was ousted from his position when he
from his lab. Actually, he's still a teacher at Harvard, but he was ousted from the lab that he did, which was an extremely important endeavor.
Right. And then he was allowed back. Right. So he was removed.
Not reinstated in the lab, I don't believe. I think his lab is still gone. He does not run the lab anymore.
Oh.
But he still does have he's still at Harvard.
Right.
It was a tragic story, and it was absolutely a group of vindictive academics. And there's a little documentary on this that used some inappropriate conduct. There was some stuff there that he shouldn't have said or done, but it didn't register high on the Richter scale, and they used that to go way farther than the university ever had before, to just try to deplatform him and prevent him from doing the research that he was doing on really important issues about like how discriminatory is police, what is the best way to educate young people, and he was coming up with non-doctrinaire ideas and data that helped enrich the public conversation, and they felt they had to shut that down, and it's exactly what they did with them.
Yeah.
So before we go into the institutions here for a second, you have some other data that you wanted to share.
Yeah, there's been a lot of research that's come out. There was a campus expression survey that came out a couple years ago saying that 60% of college students expressed reluctance to discuss at least one controversial topic. There's other research that says that nearly a quarter of American academics in the social sciences or humanities endorse ousting a colleague for having a wrong opinion about hot button issues. So really, how are we supposed to have a sense of safety and explore and push the boundaries of what we know if when we say something that's not popular, we're going to be shunned socially, or if we're in a job, we're no longer going to have our job.
Did you have a chart that represented that, or was that another point?
I don't know if we have a chart for that prepared right now. I was just drawing from something that I read.
Got it.
Yeah.
And you had some other data.
Yeah, Dan, can you maybe put up the other charts that we prepared? So one of these charts from Harvard says, I believe academic freedom in America is under threat. And both non-ladder and ladder professors responded, I strongly agree. The tenure track professors, 51% strongly agree that academic freedom in America is under threat. And another almost 30% somewhat agree. And it's a real minority of the professoriate at Harvard who disagree with that. So everyone sees this open secret. And so the question is, who's going to motivate and do something about it?
Yeah, although in fairness, it may be that some percentage, and maybe even the majority of those people, are more concerned about the threat from, like, say the DeSantis right than they are about the sort of homogenous intellectual environment on their campus that they may be responsible for promoting. Mm-hmm. They may just be completely blind to it. A lot of times, and this is an argument, by the way, that the left makes about structural racism, is that the people in power aren't aware of their own power and how they wield it. They just think that they're upholding a status quo. And it's sort of ironic that I think that's exactly what they're doing in these academic environments. They're upholding a status quo that they may feel is not stifling, but they act in 100 different ways to actually preserve that quote unquote privilege and prevent their voices from emerging.
Yeah. And the threat from the right and the left are sort of It's like a volley, and they're both true. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
Right. And it may be that they're different in nature too, right? The threat of the academic freedom from the left is sort of a homogenous ideological environment that has become sort of that's become reinforced at every turn. Peter Boghossian, the philosopher from Portland State, who's now got his own gig talking about these issues, speaks of idea laundering, and that's the role that academic journals use to sort of launder specific ideas that they agree with, and then everybody quotes everybody else, and before you know it, you have this notion of what knowledge is or what the truth is that is completely divorced from alternative thinking, from scrutiny, and everything else. So I think that's part of the picture, and I don't think that they're attuned to it. Whereas the threat to academia from the right, you could argue is not quite. I would argue is not quite as prevalent, but but in a place like Florida where they're saying you can't teach about certain subjects, I mean that's pretty brazen, I would say.
Yeah, that's not resolving the problem. That's just swinging the pendulum in the other direction and adding to the problem from a new angle. So I'm not, in favor of that. I think that all the viewpoints, I usually say I like to exclude the genocidal maniacs, like they don't really get a say at the table, but short of that, let's wrestle with all the different perspectives. And that is, inherently a Jewish value that may be something that inspires me, given the history of, Jewish thought, which is to debate and to refine our own viewpoints. And so people should ideally be committed to finding the truth, not just forwarding their own truth.
I think that's right. There was this recent row over the Florida social studies curriculum that has a line that I don't want to butcher the quote, but I'll just do my best to represent it. That slaves learned certain skills that they were then able to bring to the outside world, and people then interpreted that as meaning that. Their argument was that the curriculum wants you to think that it was good for them, that slaves benefited from slavery, and so there's this firestorm that's erupted over that. And look, it may be that was a clumsy formulation, and I'm going to dedicate myself to reading the entire curriculum. Cathy Young has an excellent piece in the Bulwark about this, and saying, look, yeah, there might have been a few things that the curriculum shouldn't say. But that doesn't mean that it was it's being characterized fairly here, and I think that's really what what's at stake here. That you have people that hear one sentence that's taken out of context of like dozens and dozens of pages on that subject, and are trying to discredit an entire conversation and prevent contextual conversations about these very difficult issues. I've argued before, for example, that yes, of course we all know that slavery happened and was a horror, and we know that the Holocaust happened, but that doesn't mean that there within those discussions there aren't legitimate differences of opinion that are interpretive in nature. So, for example, Daniel Goldhagen wrote a book called Hitler's Willing Executioners, in which he argued that it was that the average German was in on it with the Nazis, and then there was a huge debate about that. That's not to say that he's right or wrong. It's not denying the Holocaust. It just says that it's more complex than just one view. There's differences of opinion about what happened during that time and what they meant, and even within slavery. Yes, we all know chattel slavery was a gigantic. Not just tragedy, but horror committed against a group of people. It killed millions of people. It stripped people of their cultural heritage. And it kept them oppressed for decades. But that doesn't mean that there aren't issues within slavery that can't be discussed and debated. And even if I wouldn't have raised what the Florida curriculum did, I still think it's still legitimate and shouldn't be condemned as automatically sort of not towing the party line.
Yeah, and just kind of digging into that a little bit more, I would definitely encourage people to go read the actual statements that are coming out of the school districts, and do not rely on the titles that are all spin from various media. Like you need to get to the primary source and read it, which of course
Yes.
is time consuming and exhausting. And so most people don't do that. But I've seen so many times just the way it's spun in the title in the first paragraph. And meanwhile, people do not know what is actually in the curriculum. And so
Yeah, they
they're just
don't.
kind of
They
relying on misinformation, really.
Right. I have one of my favorite phrases when there's a controversy that emerges, and I've learned this through many years of talking about Israel and the Palestinians and Hamas and whatever, is what happened here. It's my before you go and pounce on a controversy, spend some time, wait for some of the facts to materialize, because the initial first draft of history may be just a first draft and completely wrong. And second, it takes some moral evaluation. It takes some depth to really come to an opinion. I mean, I trust Cathy Young because I read her a lot, and I think she usually does that due diligence, and so I trust it. But I'm not going to even rely on somebody like her that I trust. I'm going to still go, and we have a link to the curriculum. Dan, maybe we'll put it up in the show notes, where you can do the same. I would love to hear from people who have actually read the curriculum about that. Were there any other statistics or charts that you wanted to share? Was there one more?
Yeah, there's one more that Dan prepared around views in response to the new affirmative action ruling.
Right.
Race conscious admissions. Yeah. So views on race conscious admissions. Do you want to?
You go ahead. You go ahead and characterize.
Okay. One says, I agree with the Supreme Court's decision to take up this issue. I agree. Only 8.6%, I think, agree.
Strongly agree. Yeah.
Strongly agree with the Supreme Court's decision. And the next row says, I agree with Harvard's defense of race-conscious admissions policies, and that's 50% strongly agree and 25% somewhat agree. And then it's just a minority of people who disagree.
Right. But even if you look at the Supreme Court's decision to take it up, Dan, would you please put that back? About 9%, 8.6% say I agree. 10%, 10.1% say I somewhat agree. And 36.8% say that they neither agree or disagree. So of that, that's like over 50% are not opposed to it. And it tells you that hidden among all this ideological homogeneity is actually some ideological heterogeneity, that there actually are people who are willing to discuss these issues. They're just sort of suppressed. And I agree with Harvard's race conscious policy. It's a sort of there's 50% say that they agree with it, so these two bars don't line up perfectly well in the data, but it just shows us some ambiguity. There's room there, and that's part of what we tried to do in the letter. It's like, let's find as many of these heterodox voices we can ourselves, and certainly Jewish heterodox voices, and bring them out and provide a platform. Let's challenge them to actually say what's on their mind. I mean, one of the people who signed the letter says, "Time to speak up." This was their vehicle for saying what they've been thinking. They were ready to, and they did it. I'm proud that this letter served that purpose. Before we end, and I know we're getting to a little past 30 minutes, but I want to spend a little time here. You had mentioned that institutions are sort of may not be recoverable. That's a theory from the University of Austin, Texas. You had mentioned that might be an issue. And that we might have to create new institutions. What do you think? Are these institutions recoverable? Can we, or writ large, not just us, but can we, heterodox thinkers, reclaim heterodoxy within the academy?
Well, I think I'm somewhere between a realist and an optimist, and I think yes, but I also like the new alternatives that are being built from the ground up as viewpoint diversity spaces, and maybe with that new competition available in the country, the legacy institutions will gain some inspiration from that and do better. And I think there's a lot of crossover between these different institutions. So all the faculty at this new place are drawn from a lot of the elite institutions around the country. So, it's really mostly the same people. I think at the new place, there's like some journalists and other types of leaders as well. But I think with more options around, like school choice kind of thing, maybe this will help lift up everybody. And if there's one person speaking up, it's going to give it's going to create space for other people to have the courage to speak up as well. And so, I gain a lot of enthusiasm from this list. I'm like looking down this list. Oh, I know all these, I know these people, I know of them. And I trust their care for the situation. And so I think more and more people might come on board the more that they hear that there are people who are taking the risk to speak up, such as me.
Right. So I put up a link by, again, I mentioned it earlier, Cathy Young. Cathy Young is a writer for the Bulwark. She's, I'd say, center left, but also critical of some of the ideology. I'm going to show another comment from John Levine, who's a longtime mentor of mine and also himself a scholar. That quote translated says, "Some slavery wasn't bad after all." Come on now. It was a terrible statement without qualification. I hope it's okay, John, that I put that up. And I think, look, taken alone, that's true. But the question is, was it qualified? In other words, if you actually read that in context, was it qualified? And somebody else in a very exchange on social media that I know basically said, look, it may be that Jews in Auschwitz also gained some skills. She said, but I'm pretty sure they didn't like it. In other words, to say that may be true, that there were skills gained even in a horrific institution. Now, would I emphasize that? Probably not. I'm gonna do my due diligence and read the whole curriculum. But I worry about the nature of the discourse that just sort of highlights one statement like that and then says, look, these are a bunch of racists. The truth is that these were mostly African-American scholars that wrote it. There were African-American scholars who defended it. And I do think it's important for us to be able to have, in-depth conversations and not say, okay, therefore it's a completely racist conversation or curriculum from top to bottom. I think that's the danger. Someone here, I'm going to put up someone here, A. Goldstein. I don't think that's you. Maybe it is. Is that maybe that is from the Florida standards were written by a working group that included teachers or school district staff who work in elementary education, social studies, or teaching Black history. So again, this was poured over by scholars. It wasn't just Ron DeSantis sitting on his own computer and writing. And I think we have to contend with that and ask ourselves, what does this actually say? So.
Yeah. I think back to something Bill Maher said a while ago. He said, you can't learn history from social media sound bites. And I think there's a lot of cherry picking that goes on. People, read a headline or they see a sentence and then they kind of run with it thinking that they know the depth and the complexity of what's going on, when obviously it's more complex than that. And we need to take time, make the effort to discern, the full conversation.
Right. Again, A. Goldstein says, any attempt to, and I think he might be quoting, two members of the working group, William Allen and Francis Presley Rice, both Black, wrote a statement that was shared by the education department. I watched the video of them saying this: any attempt to reduce slaves to just victims of oppression fails to recognize their strength, courage, and resiliency during a difficult time in American history. So again, we can weigh these things and still find fault with the Florida curriculum without coming to sort of hasty conclusions that it's just a racist enterprise. And that's what I'm hoping to do is to let's open up the conversation. Let's look at it in its fullness and let's ask ourselves, is this really as problematic as being presented? That's what I'm hoping we'll do. And that's what I think the role of the academy is, going back to our main purpose of this conversation. The role of the academy is to do that, not to say we've got one favorite position. It's to do that. And so that's why, Marcy, I'm so glad you're going to help us with this work. I'm so glad that you're going to be helping us reinstate some measure of rationality and heterodoxy into the academy, and that we're going to leverage that, I hope, in the months ahead within the Jewish community to tell the Jewish community, guys, this is a problem. It's infecting everything in our society, our core institutions, in our society. It's going to affect us. It already is. Let's contend with that. You don't have to agree with me or Marcy or Brandy about everything, but not have this conversation about it, to stifle the conversation because it might feel threatening. I think that's really problematic, and I think that's what we at JILV are there to do. We're there to sort of bring it to the front door and say, you all, here it is. Are you really going to continue not to have this conversation? And we're finding many more Jewish organizations are increasingly willing to have it. So yeah. I think the door's partially open, and it's both in the academy and in the Jewish world, and it's our job to sort of shove it open a little bit more.
Yeah. I also wanted to mention one of my heroines from whom I gain inspiration, which is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And, one of her best friends was Antonin Scalia, with whom she disagreed, vehemently. But I read that they vacationed together, and they kind of knew that iron sharpens iron, or as iron sharpens iron, two minds, sharpen each other. And so to know what I think even better, I should be in conversation with somebody who thinks differently. And yes. I do always, think back to her because, she was inspired, I think, by some Jewish values as well that, go back to ethics of the fathers, who is wise, one who learns from every person.
Absolutely.
So there's something to learn, even if I learn that I disagree with that person, but in being able to articulate my disagreement, I know what I think more deeply and with, more clarity. So I hope that inspires, everybody, particularly Jewish scholars who are anywhere on the spectrum of religious to non-religious, that these, that our wisdom tradition offers so many examples of how to be in constructive conversation and to avoid vitriol and to welcome others so that we can move forward constructively and collectively.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Welcome aboard. We're really happy to have you.
Thank you so much.
And there's going to be more. Marcy, you were great, so we're going to bring you back. And to you all, to Marcy, Shabbat Shalom, and to you all, Shabbat Shalom. Have a great weekend.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone.